The rain in Seattle always felt like a presence, not just weather. It was a damp, persistent guest, blurring the edges of the city lights outside our apartment window, turning the world into a watercolor smudge. Tonight it felt like it was weeping with me, a miserable echo of the storm inside my own skull. I traced a finger over the condensation on the glass, the city lights fracturing into 1,000 tiny stars, none of them bright enough to navigate by. This apartment, our apartment. Every corner was a memory, a layer added to the structure of the life Clara and I had built over the past 7 years. The reclaimed wood shelves in the living room, a project we'd spent a weekend on, laughing, covered in sawdust. The specific shade of blue on the kitchen wall, chosen after weeks of debate. The view of the Space Needle from the bedroom window, a constant reminder of how far we'd come, how we'd built something significant here. 8 hours and a lifetime away from everything I'd known. I moved for her. Left my family, my friends, a solid job offer in my hometown, a job that would have set me up perfectly. Clara had a chance at a prestigious firm here, a career trajectory she couldn't pass up. And I was in love. I was an architect, a builder of structures, and I believed in building a life with her. So I packed my bags, transferred what felt like half my savings to cover the initial costs in this absurdly expensive city, and followed her. No regrets. I told myself. Love was the foundation. Liam came later. My best friend from college. We'd bonded over late-night design critiques and shared dreams of shaping cityscapes. He was struggling back home, and I saw an opportunity here for him, maybe even a chance to collaborate. I leveraged some early connections I'd made, talked him up, helped him find a foothold. He moved out about 2 years ago. We fell back into that comfortable rhythm of old friends, beers, talking shop, sharing frustrations about clients. He fit seamlessly into our lives, became part of the blueprint. Weekends were often the three of us, exploring the city, talking for hours in our living room. He was family, the chosen kind you build when your blood family is miles away. Looking back, maybe the cracks were there, subtle hairline fractures I chose to ignore, focusing instead on the grand design. Clara had become more distant over the last year. Not overtly hostile, just separate. Conversations felt transactional. The easy intimacy we once shared had faded, replaced by a polite roommate dynamic that gnawed at me. I attributed it to stress from her demanding job, the pressures of city life. I worked harder, tried to be more supportive, more attentive, trying to shore up the foundation I felt subtly shifting beneath my feet. I poured my energy into my own projects, trying to build something solid when my personal life felt increasingly abstract. Then the email. It wasn't even addressed to me. It was a draft, unsent, open on Clara's laptop screen when she'd left it open on the kitchen counter. A subject line I didn't recognize. Curiosity, or maybe that creeping unease finally demanding attention, made me click. It was to Liam. A long, rambling confession. About feelings. About how long it had been going on. About how they'd had to be careful, especially after I'd helped him get the gig at that firm. About how grateful they were that I was so trusting. And a little oblivious. Oblivious. The word hit me like a physical blow, shattering the fragile peace I'd constructed. They were talking about me, my life, my trust. And it wasn't just feelings. There were references to shared weekends away I thought were work trips for Clara. Mentions of late nights at the office that apparently weren't spent at the office. Dates. Specific dates that lined up with times I was out of town for work or visiting family alone. The betrayal wasn't a sudden crack, it was a systematic demolition. They hadn't just chipped away at the edges, they'd hollowed out the core of my life, leaving me standing on thin air. My best friend, my partner of 7 years. Collaborating not just romantically, but using the very connections I provided to build something for themselves on the ruins of what I thought we had. The blueprint was a lie. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the laptop. The rain outside seemed to intensify, hammering against the glass, mirroring the frantic beat of my heart. Oblivious. A mark of resilience. I used to joke about my scar. Now, it just felt like another place I was vulnerable, another opening they'd exploited without me even seeing it. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. The shock was too profound, a cold, paralyzing wave washing over me. I just stood there, the email glowing on the screen, the words blurring through a sudden hot film over my eyes, oblivious. When Clara came home an hour later, shaking the rain from her coat, she found me sitting on the living room floor, the laptop still open on the coffee table. The silence in the apartment was heavy, broken only by the drumming rain. She followed my gaze to the screen, her face drained of colour. "Ethan," she whispered, a sound like tearing fabric. Liam arrived shortly after, probably expecting to join us for a casual Friday night. He walked in, saw the scene, saw Clara's face, saw the laptop. His usual easy grin vanished. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. The confrontation wasn't a single event. It was a series of brutal, disjointed exchanges over the next few days. Initial shock gave way to their desperate attempts to control the narrative. Denial, brief and unconvincing, was quickly replaced by a torrent of blame. "It wasn't like that, Ethan," Clara started, her voice trembling but her eyes avoiding mine. "It just happened." "Happened," I managed, the word tasting like ash. "For months? Years? The trips? The late nights?" Liam chimed in, his voice surprisingly steady, the voice of a man already calculating the angles. "Look, man, things change. People change." "Change?" I repeated, standing up, feeling the fragile structure of my control begin to crack. "You built this behind my back, in my house, using things I gave you." That's when the gaslighting started, subtle at first, then escalating. "You weren't happy, Ethan," Clara said, her voice gaining a strange, defensive edge. "You were always so focused on work, distant." "Distant?" I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "I moved across the country for you. I turned down my dream job. I worked my ass off so we could afford this." I gestured wildly around the apartment, the symbol of everything I'd built, and they'd dismantled. "That was your choice," she countered, her eyes hardening. "And honestly, you always made things so difficult, so intense. We couldn't talk to you about how we felt." Liam nodded, reinforcing her words. "Yeah. There was just this tension. It was easier to just fall into it. Easier. Betrayal was easier than talking. Demolishing my life was the path of least resistance." "You were never really present, Ethan," Clara continued, twisting the knife. "Always in your head. Maybe if you'd been more available, this wouldn't have happened. It was my fault. Their secret affair, the lies, the betrayal, the potential professional backstabbing, it was all because I wasn't available enough. I wasn't present enough. My dedication was recast as distance, my trust as naivete. My pain was already being reframed as the cause of their actions, not the consequence. My carefully constructed reality was crumbling, piece by agonizing piece, under the weight of their lies. The arguments went in circles, fueled by my shock and their defensive manipulations. There was no genuine apology, no remorse for the act itself, only regret at being caught. Their focus was on minimizing the damage to themselves, on justifying their actions by dissecting my perceived flaws. Then came the hammer blow. "You need to leave," Clara said, her voice cold, devoid of the warmth I had loved for 7 years. We were standing in the living room, the site of so many shared memories, now a battleground. "Leave?" I stared at her, incredulous. "This is my home. I'm on the lease. I paid half the down payment. I helped pay the mortgage." "I know," she said, looking away again towards the rain-streaked window. "But I can't be here with you right now. It's too difficult." "Difficult for you?" My voice rose, finally breaking. "You cheated on me with my best friend, in this apartment, and I have to leave." "It's just space," Liam interjected, ever the voice of false reason. "You guys need space to figure things out." "Figure what out?" I rounded on him. "You think I'm figuring out whether I want to be betrayed by my best friend, whether I want my life blown up?" Clara cut in, her tone firm. "I need to stay here. My job is here. It's close to everything. It's just easier for me. Easier. Always easier for them. We can figure out the finances later, but you need to find somewhere else. Now." The audacity was breathtaking. I was the one who had been violated, lied to, betrayed, and I was being kicked out of my own home by the people who did it. They were leveraging my shock, my pain, my disorientation to gain control of the physical space, the tangible representation of the life they had destroyed. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations I couldn't afford, frantic apartment hunting in a brutal market, and the soul-crushing process of packing up 7 years of a life that turned out to be a mirage. Every box I packed was a monument to a lie. Every shared item I had to decide the fate of felt like a piece of my own identity being ripped away. The scar on my eyebrow felt like a tiny, insignificant scratch compared to the gaping wound that had been torn through my chest. Liam vanished from my immediate orbit, but I knew he was still there, still with Clara. Their names became a constant, painful hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. Clara remained in the apartment, cold and distant, our interactions limited to strained logistics about moving furniture and forwarding mail. She maintained her narrative. I was difficult. I was distant. This was an outlet. For her, somehow my fault. She made the process of leaving my own home feel like a punishment I deserved. I found a small studio apartment in a different neighborhood. It was sterile, anonymous, a stark contrast to the home we had built. Moving in felt less like starting fresh and more like being exiled. The boxes sat unpacked for days. I barely ate. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, my mind replaying every conversation, searching for clues I'd missed, signs of the rot beneath the surface. Oblivious. The word echoed in the empty space of the studio, a constant indictment. The isolation in the studio was a physical weight. In the apartment with Clara, even with the distance between us, there had been a baseline human presence. Now there was just silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the relentless Seattle rain outside. I was alone in a city I had moved to for someone who had systematically dismantled my life. My family was thousands of miles away, worried but unable to truly grasp the depth of the psychological warfare I was enduring. My old friends, the ones I'd drifted from over the years, felt like ghosts from another lifetime. Then came the social fallout. Clara and Liam, it turned out, weren't content with just taking my home and my partner and my friend. They were actively managing the narrative among our mutual acquaintances. Subtle comments, carefully worded explanations, painting me as the unstable one, the difficult one, the one who had driven Clara away with my supposed emotional unavailability or intensity. I'd get awkward texts from people I hadn't spoken to in months, hinting at things they'd heard. "Heard you guys are going through a tough time, man. Clara mentioned things were complicated. Complicated. That was the word they used for betrayal. One evening, I ran into Chloe, a mutual friend from our old social circle, at a grocery store. The air between us was thick with unspoken knowledge. She mumbled something about being sorry to hear about everything. Did she tell you what happened?" I asked, my voice hesitant. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, looking at the floor. "Yeah, she said it was really hard. For her. That you guys had grown apart, and that you were struggling. Struggling. Yes, I was struggling. Struggling to breathe under the weight of their lies. Struggling to understand how two people I loved and trusted could be so utterly devoid of empathy. She said you were really angry," Chloe added, still not meeting my eyes. "Angry? Yes, I was angry. But her framing made it sound like I was the aggressor, the problem, not the victim reacting to profound violation. It was another layer of gaslighting, filtered through a third party. They weren't just taking my life. They were taking my story, twisting it into something unrecognizable. The isolation deepened. I stopped reaching out. Every interaction felt like navigating a minefield, unsure who had heard what, who believed their version. The city, once full of possibility, became a hostile landscape. Seeing couples walking hand in hand felt like a personal insult. Passing buildings I'd worked on, structures I'd helped bring to life, felt like a cruel mockery when my own life's structure had been so thoroughly demolished. My work suffered. Focus was impossible. My mind was a broken record, cycling through the betrayal, the lies, the blame. Oblivious, difficult, not present. Was it true? Had I been so wrapped up in my own head, my own career, my own sacrifices that I'd missed the signs? Had I somehow earned this? The self-blame was insidious, a poison seeping into every thought, reinforced by their narrative and the silence of those who believed it. I started drinking more. Not heavily at first, just a couple of beers to quiet the noise before bed. But the noise never truly stopped, and the number of beers crept up. It was a temporary anesthetic, numbing the edges of the pain, but leaving the core wound festering. One particularly bad night, after seeing a photo on a mutual friend's feed, Clara and Liam laughing, looking utterly comfortable together at a place we used to go, I hit rock bottom. The image was a physical blow, a confirmation of my worst fears, a deliberate act designed to twist the knife. They weren't just moving on, They were doing it publicly, seemingly without a care in the world, in the very life they'd stolen from me. I felt a surge of white-hot rage, quickly followed by a crushing wave of despair. What was the point? Everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed, had been a foundation for their happiness, their new life, built on my ruins. I was alone, broke. The legal fight over the apartment was draining me, professionally adrift and emotionally shattered. The city felt like a cage. A colleague, noticing my rapid decline, gently but firmly suggested I talk to someone. He hadn't known Clara or Liam well, hadn't been exposed to their narrative, and saw only my visible distress. He gave me the name of a therapist, Dr. Evelyn Reed. I resisted at first. Therapy felt like admitting defeat, like confirming I was the struggling one, the broken one Clara claimed I was. But the pain was a physical agony, and the thought of another night alone with the crushing weight of my own thoughts was unbearable. Desperation finally drove me to make the call. Dr. Reed's office was calm, quiet, a stark contrast to the storm in my head. She was older, with kind, steady eyes and a quiet presence. Sitting across from her felt alien. How could I possibly condense the sprawling 7-year demolition of my life into 50 minutes? My first few sessions were difficult. I talked in circles, focused on the events, the facts of the betrayal, the injustice of being kicked out. I struggled to articulate the emotional impact, the gaslighting, the self-blame. It felt safer to talk about the crumbling structure of my life than the gaping hole in my soul. Dr. Reed listened patiently. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell me what to do. She just created a space for the chaos in my head. "It sounds like you've experienced a profound loss, Ethan," she said gently in one session. "Not just of a relationship, but of your sense of home, your sense of self, and your trust in people you were closest to. Loss. Yes, it felt like a death. The death of a future, the death of a past I thought I understood, the death of the person I thought I was. They're saying it was my fault," I finally managed to say, the words raw and difficult, that I was difficult, distant. Dr. Reed leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, abuse is never the victim's fault. What they did was a choice. Their choice. And their attempts to blame you for it are a common tactic to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. It's a form of manipulation called gaslighting. It's designed to make you doubt your own reality." Gaslighting. The word resonated. It was a name for the insidious poison that had been creeping into my thoughts, making me question everything. It didn't erase the pain, but it offered a flicker of clarity in the suffocating fog of self-blame. It wasn't me. It was them. A fragile, terrifying thought. Therapy wasn't a magic fix. The clarity Dr. Reed offered was often fleeting, quickly swallowed by the overwhelming tide of pain, confusion, and triggers. Every time I felt a tiny step forward, something would happen to send me tumbling back down. The legal battle over the apartment dragged on, a constant, draining reminder of the life I'd lost and the people who had taken it. Emails from lawyers were like paper cuts, small but persistent sources of pain. Documents detailing the property, the mortgage, the shared finances, they were artifacts from a life I no longer had, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. Clara's lawyer was cold, efficient, treating it purely as a transaction, devoid of the emotional wreckage it represented for me. I imagined Clara and Liam discussing it over dinner, planning their future in the home I had helped build. And then there was social media. Even though I had unfollowed Clara and Liam, the digital world was a vast, interconnected web. Mutual friends, people who hadn't taken sides but remained connected to both of us, would post pictures of group gatherings, parties, casual weekends, and sometimes in the background, or even front and centre, would be Clara and Liam, laughing, smiling, looking happy. Each image was a fresh wound. It felt deliberate, a calculated cruelty. They knew people I was still connected to would see. It was like they were parading their stolen happiness in front of me, a constant visual confirmation that they were thriving while I was drowning. The rain outside my studio window seemed to weep harder on those nights, blurring the city lights into streaks of sorrow. I tried to explain this to Dr. Reed. It's like they're everywhere. I can't escape it. I see them, and it's like the whole thing just happened again. The shock, the pain, the feeling of being irrelevant. "Those are triggers, Ethan," she explained. Visual reminders that pull you back into the trauma response. It's incredibly difficult when the people who hurt you are still present in your environment, even indirectly. But they look so happy, I choked out, the unfairness of it a physical ache in my chest. Like none of this affected them, like I never mattered. Their outward appearance isn't necessarily a reflection of their internal state, Ethan, Dr. Reed said softly. But even if they are happy, that doesn't diminish the reality of what they did or the pain you are experiencing. Their happiness is not a judgment on your worth. Logically, I knew she was right, but the emotional brain is a stubborn, irrational thing. The images, the knowledge that they were together, living the life I had envisioned for Clara and me, felt like proof that I was somehow less than, easily replaced, disposable. Why wasn't I enough? The question echoed in the empty rooms of my mind, a relentless, self-inflicted torture. The drinking escalated. It became a ritual. Come home from a day spent trying to focus at work, where I felt like a ghost haunting my own office, and reach for the bottle. The first few sips brought a dulling relief, a temporary reprieve from the churning anxiety, but it never lasted. Soon, the alcohol just amplified the despair, turning my thoughts darker, more self-destructive. I stopped going out, even to the few places I felt safe. The thought of running into someone, of having to put on a brave face, or worse, of seeing Clara or Liam, was paralyzing. My studio apartment became my cage. I stopped answering calls from people who weren't Dr. Reed or my lawyer. I neglected basic things. Grocery shopping became a monumental effort. Laundry piled up. The dishes in the sink were a testament to my inertia. The scar above my eyebrow, once a quirky detail, felt heavy, a physical manifestation of the deeper invisible wounds that refused to heal. I'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, tracing it, wondering if the damage was visible now, if everyone could see how broken I was. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares were frequent, vivid replays of the discovery, the confrontation, the feeling of being pushed out of my own home. Sometimes the dreams were abstract, structures collapsing around me, foundations crumbling, leaving me falling into an endless void. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, the terror lingering long after I opened my eyes. The thought, initially ain't whisper in the darkest corners of my mind, began to grow louder, a seductive, dangerous idea. What if I just made it stop? It hovered at the edges of my consciousness, a forbidden thought I pushed away. But as the pain intensified, as the isolation deepened, as the legal and financial stress mounted, as the triggers kept coming, the whisper became a murmur, then a voice, then a siren song. Therapy felt like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. Dr. Reed was a lifeline, but the water was rising too fast. I talked about the despair, the hopelessness, the feeling that there was no way out. I hinted at the dark thoughts skirting around the edges of the unspeakable. "Ethan, I'm concerned about how low you're feeling," she said one session, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you having thoughts of harming yourself?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Admitting it felt like making it real, like giving it power. But the alternative was continuing to drown alone. "Yes," I finally managed, the word barely audible, sometimes, a lot lately. She didn't flinch. "Thank you for telling me, Ethan. That takes incredible courage. Have you made any plans?" Plans. The thought had gone beyond abstract contemplation. It had started to take shape, a horrifying architectural design in my mind, a way out, a final exit. I didn't answer immediately. The rain outside had stopped, but the grey sky was still heavy, pressing down on the city, on me. The silence in the room was immense. "Ethan?" Dr. Reed prompted softly. "I don't know," I lied, the lie feeling like another brick added to the wall I was building around myself, a wall designed not to keep others out, but to contain the explosion I felt coming. The truth was, the plans were becoming concrete. Building a life had felt impossible. Destroying it felt achievable. A final act of control in a situation where I had lost all control. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of waking up in the sterile studio, the hangover dulling the edges of the immediate pain, facing the daunting prospect of simply existing for another day, trying to work, failing, drinking, and falling into an exhausted, nightmare-ridden sleep. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for the inevitable. The legal fight over the apartment reached a particularly nasty phase. Clara and her lawyer were pushing for terms that were deeply unfair, leveraging my desperation and emotional state. It felt like another calculated move to squeeze the last bit of life out of me, to make sure I was utterly broken and couldn't fight back. My lawyer, bless his pragmatic soul, focused on the numbers, the law, the cold facts. But for me, it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, about the violation, about them trying to take even the financial value of the home I'd helped build. Each legal document was a reminder that the people who betrayed me were still actively causing me harm, still benefiting from what they had done. One afternoon, walking back to my apartment, I saw Liam. He was coming out of a coffee shop a few blocks away. He didn't see me at first. He was laughing, talking on his phone, looking completely at ease. The sight of him, happy and carefree in the city where he had helped dismantle my life, sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated hatred through me. It was a visceral reaction, a physical urge to confront him, to scream, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had inflicted. But I froze, hidden in a doorway, watching him walk away, a casual figure in the urban landscape, utterly unaware of the storm he had unleashed. The moment passed, leaving behind a bitter residue of impotence and rage. The thought of ending it all wasn't just a thought anymore. It was a plan, a detailed, step-by-step process. I researched methods, looking for something quick, something certain, something that wouldn't leave me a vegetable, as the original narrator had chillingly put it. The architect in me, the part of my brain trained to plan and execute complex designs, was now morbidly focused on designing my own destruction. I thought about location. Not the apartment. I didn't want to leave that kind of mess there. Somewhere impersonal, somewhere public maybe, a final, silent scream against the indifference of the city. Or somewhere quiet, private, just gone. Dr. Reed continued to be a presence, a weekly anchor in the storm. I talked more openly about the despair, the lack of hope, but I still held back the full extent of the planning. Part of me knew that if I told her everything, she would intervene, hospitalize me. And part of me, the part that was utterly exhausted and just wanted the pain to end, didn't want to be stopped. I was tired of fighting. Fighting Clara, fighting Liam, fighting the lawyers, fighting the self-blame, fighting the constant, agonizing pain. I just wanted peace. "Ethan, I know this is incredibly difficult," Dr. Reed said, her voice filled with compassion. "But there is a way through this. Healing is possible." Healing felt like a cruel joke. How could you heal from having your entire foundation removed? How could you rebuild when the ground beneath you was poisoned? "It doesn't feel possible," I admitted, the words heavy with despair. "It feels like this is just the end of the line. I don't see a future. When you're in this much pain, it's incredibly hard to see beyond the present moment," she acknowledged. "Your brain is in survival mode, overwhelmed. But that doesn't mean a future doesn't exist. It just means you can't perceive it right now." Her words were like a faint light in a deep, dark well. I could see the light, but I didn't have the strength to climb towards it. I started to say goodbye, in my head. Not to Clara or Liam. They were already gone, replaced by bitter caricatures in my mind. But to the few people who still cared. My family back home, who called regularly, their voices filled with concern I couldn't reciprocate. My colleague who had recommended Dr. Reed, who still checked in occasionally. Chloe, even with her awkwardness, was a reminder that not everyone had bought the narrative. I thought about writing letters, explaining, trying one last time to make them understand the depth of the damage. But the energy felt too immense. It was easier to just disappear, leave them to piece together the wreckage. The date was set in my mind. A few days away. Enough time to finalize the plan, to gather what I needed, to have one last therapy session where I would continue to pretend I was just struggling, not planning my exit. The days leading up to it were strange. A mix of grim determination and a terrifying emptiness. The world felt muted, colors less vibrant, sounds muffled. The constant anxiety was replaced by a chilling calm, the peace that comes with making a final decision. I went through the motions of daily life, showering, dressing, trying to work, but it felt like watching someone else inhabit my body. I walked through the city, looking at the buildings, the structures I used to admire, the ones I aspired to build. They seemed so solid, so permanent. Unlike me. unlike my life, which had crumbled like a poorly constructed model under the slightest pressure. I thought about the principles of architecture, the importance of a strong foundation, load-bearing walls, structural integrity. My own structure had failed, spectacularly. Dr. Reed's office felt like a sanctuary, albeit a temporary one. In my last session before the planned date, I looked at her, this kind stranger who had tried so hard to pull me back from the edge. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing I was deceiving her, knowing the path I was about to take. "How are you feeling today, Ethan?" she asked, her gaze steady. "Better," I lied. "Just tired. Really tired." It wasn't a complete lie. I was bone-deep tired of the pain, the fight, the sheer effort of existing. She seemed to sense something, a shift in my demeanor. Her eyes searched mine. "Ethan, if things feel overwhelming, please reach out. To me, to a crisis line, to anyone. You don't have to carry this alone." I nodded, a tight, rehearsed movement. "I know. Thank you, Dr. Reed. Thank you for trying. Thank you for seeing me, even when I felt invisible." But it wasn't enough. It couldn't fix the fundamental damage. The foundation was gone. Leaving her office, the grey Seattle sky felt heavier than ever. The rain had started again, a fine mist that coated everything in a slick, miserable sheen. I walked through the city streets, the noise of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic slosh of my own footsteps in puddles. It all felt distant, unreal. I was a ghost already, walking through a world I was about to leave. The plan was simple, private, final. I had acquired what I needed. It was waiting for me back at the sterile studio apartment, the place that felt less like a home and more like a tomb I had inadvertently rented for myself. I didn't go straight back. I walked for hours, the city a blur around me. I passed by the building where Clara worked, a sleek glass and steel tower. I looked up, wondering if she was inside, oblivious to my final moments, already building her new life with Liam on the floors below. The thought was a cold, sharp pain, but it lacked the intensity it once held. The despair had dulled the edges of even the most agonizing emotions. I walked towards the waterfront, the air growing colder, smelling of salt and damp concrete. The ferry horn sounded in the distance, mournful calls across the grey water. I stood by the railing, looking out at the Puget Sound, the islands hazy in the distance. It was beautiful, in a desolate, lonely way. A fitting backdrop. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister back home. "Thinking of you, Ethan. Love you." A simple message, a lifeline thrown across the country. I looked at it for a long time. Love you. Did they know? Could they feel the silence growing around me? The thought of their pain, the wreckage I would leave behind, was a heavy weight. But it wasn't enough to counteract the crushing weight of my own suffering. The pain of staying felt greater than the pain my absence would cause. That's what the trauma had done. It had distorted my perspective, warped my sense of connection and consequence. I texted back, "Love you too. Everything's okay." Another lie. The last one, maybe. As darkness fell, the city lights began to twinkle, reflecting on the wet pavement. The Space Needle was lit up, a beacon piercing the gloom. I used to look at it from our apartment window, full of hope for the future. Now it just looked like a needle, sharp and indifferent. I walked back to the studio. The key felt heavy in my hand. Opening the door felt like stepping into the end. The air inside was cold and still. The unpacked boxes seemed to mock me. The silence was deafening. I went through the final steps of my plan, moving with a strange, detached efficiency. My architect's brain focused on execution. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just completion. I sat down, the means ready. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs, a final, desperate protest from a body that wanted to live, even when the mind had given up. My hands were shaking again, not from cold, but from a deep, primal fear that no amount of despair could entirely extinguish. I closed my eyes. Images flashed through my mind, not the good memories, but the bad ones. Clara's face as she blamed me, Liam's casual shrug, the empty space where our life used to be, the judgmental look in Chloe's eyes, the cold text from Clara's lawyer, the pictures of them laughing, the word oblivious echoing in the silence. The pain was a physical entity, a burning, tearing sensation in my chest. I couldn't breathe. Panic, sharp and sudden, flooded my system. Not the despair, but pure, animal terror. My body convulsed, a desperate, involuntary rejection of the path I had chosen. I doubled over, gasping for air, the means falling from my shaking hands and clattering uselessly across the floor. I threw up, the bitter bile burning my throat, splashing onto the cold, hard floor. It was messy, undignified, a raw, visceral expulsion of the poison that had been building inside me. I lay there, on the floor of the sterile studio, covered in sweat and vomit, gasping, shaking, sobbing. The tears came in waves, hot and uncontrollable, a release of months of pent-up agony. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just feeling the raw, searing pain, the profound loss, the utter brokenness. But beneath it, beneath the despair, beneath the terror, was something else. A flicker. A tiny, fragile spark. It was the instinct to survive. The same instinct that made my body convulse, that made me throw up, that made me gasp for air. The basic, fundamental drive to cling to life, even when life felt unbearable. I lay there for a long time, the sobs gradually subsiding into ragged breaths. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less like a tomb, more like an empty space waiting to be filled. I looked at the scattered items on the floor, the means of my intended destruction. They looked alien, horrifying. This wasn't the answer. It wasn't an escape. It was just an end. And in that moment, covered in the physical manifestation of my despair, I realized I didn't want it to end. Not like this. Not defeated, not defined by their betrayal, not alone and broken on the floor of a rented room. Survival wasn't about being happy. It wasn't about healing overnight. It wasn't about getting justice or making them understand the depth of their cruelty. It was just about choosing to keep breathing, choosing to face the pain, however immense, rather than succumbing to it. Slowly, painstakingly, I pushed myself up from the floor. My limbs ached, my head throbbed, my chest felt hollowed out. I stumbled to the bathroom, washed my face, rinsed out my mouth. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were red and swollen, my face pale. The scar above my eyebrow seemed more prominent than ever, a line etched into my skin, a reminder of a different kind of wound. I went back into the living area. The scattered items were still there. I gathered them up, my hands still trembling, and put them away, somewhere out of sight. The act felt significant, a small, deliberate step away from the edge. The studio was still sterile, still lonely. The rain was still falling outside. The pain was still there, a dull, persistent ache. The self-blame still whispered in the corners of my mind, though its voice was momentarily quieter. But I had made a choice. A desperate, messy, terrifying choice. I had chosen to live. It wasn't a triumphant moment. There was no sudden surge of hope, no miraculous feeling of peace. It was just survival. The first, shaky breath after nearly drowning. The first, painful step on a path I couldn't yet see, a path that promised more struggle, more pain, more triggers. But it was a path. And for the first time in months, the possibility of a future, however daunting, felt infinitesimally larger than the certainty of the end. I didn't know how I was going to make it through the next day, let alone the rest of my life. The legal battle was still looming. Clara and Liam were still out there, living their lives. The isolation was still a heavy cloak. The trauma was still a raw, open wound. But I had survived the lowest point. I had faced the abyss, and in a messy, undignified, terrifying moment, had recoiled from it. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The real construction project wasn't a building in the city. It was rebuilding myself, piece by agonizing piece, from the ground up. And I had just laid the first fragile stone. I stumbled towards the window, looked out at the rain-streaked city lights, the blurred, imperfect world outside. It was still there, and so was I. The morning after felt less like a new dawn and more like waking up in the ruins. My body ached, my head pounded, and the emotional hangover was worse than any physical one. The memory of the night before was vivid, horrifying, and deeply shameful. I had come so close. The raw terror of that moment lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. Getting out of bed felt like lifting a mountain. The apartment was silent, save for the persistent drumming of the rain. Every surface, every empty space, was a reminder of how utterly alone I was. The unpacked boxes seemed heavier, mocking my inability to even begin to rebuild. I managed to shower, letting the hot water run over me, trying to wash away the residue of the night. Looking in the mirror, my face was gaunt, my eyes hollow. The scar above my eyebrow seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a physical manifestation of the internal damage. The thought of facing the day, of pretending to function, felt impossible. Work was out of the question. Even the simplest tasks, like making coffee, felt monumental. The despair hadn't vanished. It had just shifted, now tinged with the chilling memory of how close I had come to ending it all. I knew I needed to talk to Dr. Reed. I had lied to her in our last session, and the weight of that lie, combined with the reality of my actions, was crushing. It took every ounce of strength I had, every scrap of that fragile will to survive I had found on the floor, to pick up my phone and call her office. My voice was shaky, barely a whisper, when I spoke to the receptionist. "I need to speak to Dr. Reed. It's Ethan. It's an emergency." She put me on hold, and the elevator music felt surreal, a cheerful counterpoint to the darkness engulfing me. When Dr. Reed picked up, her voice was calm, steady. "Ethan, what's going on?" The words tumbled out, disjointed, raw. I told her everything. About the plan, about acquiring the means, about being at the very edge, and about the terrifying, messy moment I had pulled back. I didn't spare the details, the shame, the vomit, the terror. I just laid it all bare. She listened without interruption, her silence on the other end of the line a comforting presence. When I finished, gasping for breath, the line was quiet for a moment. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but firm. Thank you for telling me. That was incredibly brave. What you went through last night, that was a fight for your life, and you won." Won. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving a catastrophe I had almost inflicted upon myself. I don't know what to do now," I confessed, the question that had haunted me for months still echoing. "You take the next breath, Ethan," she said. "And then the one after that. You reached out, and that was a monumental step. Can you come in today? As soon as possible?" I agreed. Getting dressed, leaving the apartment, navigating the city streets to her office, each step was an act of will, a small victory against the inertia that threatened to pull me back down. The world outside still felt muted, but the terror had subsided, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a fragile, uncertain sense of having been given a second chance. Sitting in Dr. Reed's office, the space felt different now. It was no longer just a place to talk about my problems. It was a place where I had admitted the darkest truth, a place where my life had potentially been saved. We talked for a long time, about the trauma, the gaslighting, the self-blame, the despair. She helped me process the events of the night before, validating the terror, acknowledging the shame, but always bringing it back to the fact that I had chosen to live. She talked about safety plans, about reaching out when the dark thoughts returned, about building a support system, even a small one. She emphasized that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that the pain wouldn't magically disappear, but that healing was possible, one small step at a time. "You've been through something incredibly traumatic, Ethan," she said. "It's going to take time to process, to grieve, to rebuild your sense of self, but you don't have to do it alone." The idea of rebuilding felt overwhelming. My life felt like a pile of rubble. Where did you even begin? How did you lay a new foundation when you were terrified it would crumble again? But for the first time in months, the word rebuild didn't feel like a cruel joke. It felt like a daunting, almost impossible task, but a task that was no longer entirely out of reach. I was an architect. My job was to take chaos and create structure. Maybe, just maybe, I could apply that skill to myself. Leaving Dr. Reed's office, the rain had finally stopped. A weak, watery sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting a pale light on the wet streets. The city still felt like a challenging place, full of potential triggers and reminders of what I had lost. But for the first time, I looked at the tall buildings, the cranes on the horizon, the construction sites, and saw not just reminders of my professional failures or the life I had lost, but symbols of possibility. Structures rising from disruption, foundations being laid. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest. The fear lingered, the uncertainty of the future was immense. But I had survived the night. I had reached out, and I had taken the first shaky step onto a path that, while steep and uncertain, led away from the abyss. I walked back to my sterile studio apartment, the place that had almost been my end. It was still just a rental, still impersonal. But today, it felt less like a tomb and more like a temporary shelter, a place where the fight for survival had been won, and the long, arduous process of rebuilding could begin. The boxes were still unpacked. The dishes were still in the sink. The weight of everything I had lost was still heavy, but I was alive, and that, for now, was enough. The journey back from the brink wouldn't be linear. There would be setbacks, relapses, moments of intense pain and doubt, but I had seen the absolute bottom, and I had pulled myself back. The fragile spark of survival was still there, flickering in the quiet space behind my ribs. I didn't know if I would ever fully heal. I didn't know if I would ever trust anyone like that again. I didn't know if I would ever build a life as intertwined and deeply felt as the one I had lost. But I knew, with a chilling certainty born of the night before, that the alternative was unacceptable. The fight continues. The Seattle rain gave way to the brief, precious sunshine of summer, then back to the familiar grey drizzle of autumn. The legal battle over the apartment finally concluded, leaving me financially bruised and emotionally drained, but free of that particular entanglement. Clara and Liam, I heard through the grapevine, a source I was trying to cut off but information still leaked through, were still together, seemingly unaffected by the wreckage they had left behind. Their continued existence, their apparent happiness, was a dull ache, a reminder of the injustice, but the sharp, agonizing pain it once caused had begun to fade, replaced by a weary indifference. They were characters in a story that no longer defined my present. Therapy with Dr. Reed became a cornerstone of my week. It wasn't always easy. There were sessions filled with tears, with anger, with the raw, messy process of unpacking years of trauma and manipulation. We worked through the gaslighting, identifying the specific tactics Clara and Liam had used, slowly dismantling the self-blame they had so carefully constructed in my mind. It was like peeling back layers of poisoned wallpaper, revealing the original, undamaged wall underneath, piece by painful piece. Their actions were a reflection of their character, Ethan, not yours, Dr. Reed would reiterate, a mantra against the lingering whispers of self-doubt. You were trusting. You were loyal. Those are not flaws. They are qualities that were exploited by people who lacked them. I started to rebuild, slowly, tentatively. The unpacked boxes in the studio were finally emptied, their contents finding temporary homes in the anonymous space. I started cooking again, simple meals at first, then more complex ones, finding a quiet satisfaction in the tangible process of creating something. I forced myself to go to the gym, the physical exertion a release for the pent-up anxiety and anger. Connecting with people was harder. Trust felt like a foreign language I had forgotten how to speak. The fear of being hurt again, of misreading intentions, kept me guarded. But I made small efforts. I reconnected with my colleague who had recommended Dr. Reed, meeting him for coffee, talking about work, skirting around the edges of my personal life, but grateful for the normal human interaction. I started attending a local architecture lecture series, being around people who shared my passion, a part of myself that had been dormant for too long. The isolation began to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of connection, not deep or intense like the bonds I had lost, but enough to remind me that the world was bigger than my pain. Triggers still happened. Seeing a car that looked like Clara's, walking past a restaurant we used to frequent, hearing a song that reminded me of Liam. The jolt of pain was still there, sharp and unpleasant, but I was learning to manage it. Dr. Reed had given me tools, breathing exercises, mindfulness techniques, ways to ground myself in the present moment rather than being pulled back into the trauma. The panic attacks became less frequent, less intense. I thought about the scar above my eyebrow. It was just a scar, a physical mark from a childhood accident. It didn't define me. The invisible scars were deeper, more complex, but they weren't the whole story either. They were part of my history, part of what I had survived, but they weren't my identity. The idea of dating, of forming a new romantic connection, felt impossibly far away. The thought of trusting someone with my heart again after it had been so thoroughly broken and stomped on was terrifying. But Dr. Reed encouraged me to be open to the possibility, when and if I felt ready. Healing isn't about closing yourself off, Ethan, she would say. It's about learning to discern who is safe and allowing yourself to connect with those who are. I hadn't met anyone new yet. The focus was still on rebuilding myself, on finding solid ground beneath my own feet. The journey was long, arduous, and far from over, There were still days when the despair threatened to overwhelm me, when the question, why wasn't I enough, echoed in the silence of my apartment. There were still nights when nightmares haunted my sleep. But I was alive. I was in therapy. I was slowly rebuilding a life, piece by piece. I was learning to navigate the city, not as a cage, but as a place where I was slowly, tentatively finding my footing. The rain still fell, a constant presence, but sometimes, just sometimes, I could see the faint outline of a rainbow through the mist. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future held. The trauma had left indelible marks, but I had survived the demolition. And armed with the fragile spark of survival and the tools of rebuilding, I was determined to see what kind of structure I could create from the ruins. It wouldn't be the life I had planned, the life I had built with Clara. It would be something new, something different, something that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it belonged entirely to me. The blueprint was blank, terrifying, but also, finally, my own. The process of healing wasn't a straight line. It was a tangled mess of forward steps and backward slides. There were weeks where I felt strong, where the tools Dr. Reed gave me worked, where I could look at a picture of Clara and Liam, accidentally seen on a mutual